The boarding gate at Dallas International Airport was as crowded as ever. People hurried across the terminal, dragging wheeled suitcases, while the loudspeakers announced flights departing to various destinations. Among the passengers waiting to board Flight 728 to New York was a 12-year-old boy named Malik Turner. He wore a faded blue t-shirt, jeans, and carried a small, well-worn backpack. His eyes reflected both anxiety and excitement, much like any child about to embark on a new adventure. Malik was alone, which caught the attention of some passengers nearby. He was an orphan and, after months of living in a foster home, had finally been adopted by a family in New York. The trip, organized by the adoption agency, marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Malik didn't know what to expect, but he was hopeful. He held his ticket tightly in one hand and a small envelope containing information about his new family in the other, but his thoughts were focused entirely on what awaited him. When boarding was announced, passengers began lining up. A flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a crisp uniform stood out as she took control of the process. The badge on her chest displayed her name, Ashley Montgomery. She was a veteran of the airline, known for her strict demeanor. Her voice carried authority, but there was something in her expression that, for the more observant, conveyed an unsettling coldness. Malik obediently joined the line when it was his turn, following the instructions. He handed his ticket to Ashley, who examined the document with sharp eyes. For a moment she frowned and looked up at the boy. "Where are your parents?" she asked, her voice tinged with judgment that made Malik hesitate. I'm traveling alone. I'm going to meet my new family in New York," Malik replied, giving a timid smile. Ashley scrutinized him for a few more seconds, as if deciding something. She brusquely handed the ticket back to him and said curtly, "Make sure you don't cause any trouble." Malik simply nodded and proceeded down the boarding corridor, unaware of the curious and, in some cases, uncomfortable looks Ashley was casting his way. As the airplane began to fill up, Ashley walked down the aisle, ensuring everything was in order. When Malik reached his assigned seat, he carefully placed his backpack in the overhead compartment and sat down, gazing out the window in fascination. A few minutes later, Ashley returned to the aisle, ostensibly checking passengers' seats. When she reached Malik, she stopped abruptly. She crossed her arms and looked at him with evident discomfort. "Is this your seat?" she asked sharply. "Yes, ma'am," Malik replied politely. Ashley didn't seem convinced. She took Malik's ticket and checked it, but instead of simply confirming the seat, she muttered something under her breath about how this was typical. Her behavior soon drew the attention of other nearby passengers, who began to observe the interaction. "I'm going to need you to come with me," she said abruptly. "But why? Did I do something wrong?" Malik asked, visibly confused and afraid. "Just follow me, please," she replied, ignoring the question. By now, other passengers began whispering, questioning what was happening. Malik, unsure, grabbed his backpack and followed Ashley to the front of the airplane. She made him exit through the boarding door and called over one of the ground supervisors. A tall man with graying hair approached. The badge on his chest indicated his name, Charles. He seemed surprised to see Malik standing there. "What's going on, Ashley?" Charles asked as he observed the boy. "This passenger is causing issues, and I think it would be better to reassign him," Ashley responded firmly. Charles looked at Malik, who seemed on the verge of tears. He frowned and turned back to Ashley. "What kind of issue?" Charles asked suspiciously. Ashley hesitated but maintained her stance. "I just don't think it's safe for him to travel on this flight." "Not safe? He's 12 years old," Charles replied, clearly confused. As the discussion continued, a tall, sharply dressed African-American man appeared in the terminal. His expression was serious, and his posture exuded confidence. His name was Jonathan Reed, CEO of the airline. Jonathan had been traveling anonymously for a meeting in New York, but the scene had caught his attention. He approached with firm steps, having heard enough to understand the situation. "What's going on here?" Jonathan asked in a calm but authoritative voice. Ashley, who didn't recognize Jonathan, began explaining the situation evasively, making it clear she didn't want Malik on the flight. Jonathan listened patiently, then turned his attention to the boy. He crouched down to Malik's level. "Are you okay, son?" Jonathan asked. Malik, with tears brimming in his eyes, shook his head and began to explain his situation, saying he was adopted and was on his way home for the first time. Jonathan stood up and stared at Ashley. "You said he was a problem. Exactly what did he do?" Ashley looked uncomfortable but tried to justify her decision. "I just thought it would be better for everyone's safety." "Safety?" Jonathan repeated, his tone more serious. He understood what was really happening. "Are you saying this boy is a threat? Why? Because of the color of his skin?" Ashley's eyes widened, but she tried to defend herself. "That's not what I meant." Jonathan raised his hand, cutting her off. "Here's what's going to happen. You, Charles, and I will have a private conversation. Meanwhile, this young man will board the plane and sit in the seat assigned to him." Without further discussion, Jonathan took Malik by the hand and led him back onto the plane while passengers watched curiously. When they reached Malik's seat, Jonathan crouched down again. "Listen, you didn't do anything wrong, okay? I want you to enjoy your flight and not worry about anything else. If anyone bothers you, you let me know, all right?" Malik nodded, now a bit more confident. Jonathan patted his shoulder before leaving. He returned to the boarding area, where Ashley and Charles waited, visibly nervous. Without losing his composure, Jonathan looked directly at Ashley. "I'm Jonathan Reed, CEO of this company. Now you're going to explain to me why you decided that a 12-year-old boy couldn't be on a flight that I, incidentally, will also be piloting today." Ashley turned pale. The silence between the three was almost deafening. Ashley Montgomery, still processing what she had just heard, could hardly hide the panic on her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but Jonathan Reed raised his hand, signaling that she wasn't permitted to interrupt the tense moment of reflection. Charles, on the other hand, was equally uncomfortable, shifting his gaze between the boy who had just reboarded the plane and the CEO of the airline, who had unexpectedly decided to intervene personally. Jonathan leaned against the check-in counter, crossing his arms as his sharp eyes analyzed Ashley with controlled intensity. "So I'm going to ask again, and I expect an honest answer," he said, his voice calm but full of authority. "What exactly made you think that boy, who has a valid ticket and is traveling alone to meet his new family, shouldn't be on this flight?" Ashley, who until then had always maintained complete control over every situation, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She tried to justify herself, but her words came out more like weak excuses than solid arguments. I thought it was strange that he was alone. And you know, some people can cause trouble on board," she replied, avoiding his gaze. Jonathan frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "Cause trouble? That's very vague. Was he disrespectful? Restless? Did he do anything to justify your actions? Because what I saw was a scared, confused boy being intimidated by someone who's supposed to ensure passengers' well-being." Ashley tried to defend herself again. "I didn't mean to cause discomfort. I was only thinking of what's best for the other passengers." Jonathan took a step forward, now standing more rigidly. "Don't think for a second that I didn't catch what's really going on here, Ashley. You didn't act with the passengers' best interest in mind. You acted based on a prejudice that has absolutely no place in this job. We deal with people from all walks of life, ethnicities and backgrounds. And you know what our job is: to treat them with dignity and respect, not to make baseless judgments." Charles, who had remained silent until then, decided to speak up. "Mr. Reed, perhaps we should discuss this in private." Jonathan turned to him, raising his hand once more to stop him. "No, Charles, this needs to be addressed right now. There's no room for this type of behavior in our company, and honestly, I'm disappointed that you allowed it to get to this point." Charles swallowed hard, but he knew Jonathan was right. He should have questioned Ashley's decision from the beginning, but he hadn't. Now the CEO was clearly determined to address the issue. Jonathan turned his attention back to Ashley, who was visibly uncomfortable. "Here's what's going to happen. You're not going to board this flight. I'm going to ask you to remain at the airport and wait for a meeting with the Human Resources Department as soon as we land in New York. And depending on the outcome of that meeting, we'll decide your future with this company." Ashley's eyes widened, shocked. "Mr. Reed, please, I can explain better." "There's no better explanation, Ashley. I've seen and heard enough. I will not tolerate someone with this kind of attitude representing our brand." especially when we're talking about a boy who has likely faced more challenges than most adults could imagine. Without leaving room for further arguments, Jonathan turned to Charles. Charles, make sure she is escorted to the staff lounge and stays there until the end of her shift. And please send me a detailed report about everything that happened here. I want every detail recorded. Yes, sir, Charles replied, still trying to hide his embarrassment. Jonathan turned his back and re-entered the plane, passing by passengers who had been watching the scene through the glass windows of the terminal. Upon entering the aircraft, he saw Malik staring out the window, doing his best to avoid drawing attention. Jonathan walked over to him, crouching beside the boy's seat once again. "How are you doing, son?" Jonathan asked, in a much gentler tone now. Malik looked up, still uncertain about everything that had happened, but he tried to smile. "I'm okay, sir. Just a little nervous. I've never been on a plane before." Jonathan gave a small smile. "I understand. Well, let me tell you a secret. This is also my first time flying a plane with such a brave passenger on board." Malik chuckled softly, and Jonathan continued. "Here's what you need to know. If you need anything at all, you can call the crew. They're here to help you. And most importantly, you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel like you did." Malik nodded, clearly more at ease. "Thank you, sir." Jonathan stood and patted Malik on the shoulder before returning to the cockpit. As he prepared for the flight, he reflected on what had just happened. It was unacceptable that something like that had occurred under his watch, but he was determined to ensure that such incidents would never happen again. Meanwhile, the other passengers, who had witnessed parts of the situation, began talking amongst themselves. Some praised Jonathan for his stance, while others expressed outrage at Ashley's behavior. The plane finally took off, and Malik, despite everything that had happened, felt a renewed sense of comfort as he looked out the window and saw the clouds rising closer. What Malik didn't know was that this journey would mark much more than just the start of a new life. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the atmosphere inside the cabin was relatively calm, but emotions among some passengers were still simmering. Malik, seated near the window, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, lost in thought. He tried to process the recent events, but at the same time the idea of meeting his new family in New York filled him with a mixture of hope and nervous curiosity. He could only hope the rest of the journey would be uneventful. Shortly after takeoff, Jonathan Reed left the cockpit, entrusting the controls to the co-pilot. He wanted to walk through the cabin, check on the passengers, and, most importantly, make sure Malik was feeling comfortable. Despite his dual role as CEO and pilot for the flight, Jonathan felt a greater sense of responsibility in that moment. He knew that small acts of kindness could make an enormous difference in a boy's life. As Jonathan strolled down the aisle, he caught the curious gazes of passengers who seemed to realize he wasn't just another flight crew member. When he reached Malik's row, he crouched down once again beside the boy. "How's it going, champ?" Jonathan asked in a calm, reassuring tone. Malik shrugged, trying to appear braver than he truly felt. "I think I'm okay, sir. It's a little scary, but it's also cool. I never thought I'd see the clouds this close." Jonathan smiled, understanding the boy's mix of emotions. "It's an amazing view, isn't it? I remember the first time I saw this. I must have been about your age, and you know what I thought? I thought I wanted to spend the rest of my life flying. That's how I ended up here." Malik smiled shyly. "Did you always want to be a pilot?" Jonathan nodded. "Yeah, but it wasn't easy. I had to overcome a lot of obstacles along the way. And you know what I learned from all of it? Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong somewhere. You belong wherever you want to be. Don't forget that." Malik absorbed those words like a promise, feeling a small but growing sense of reassurance. Jonathan patted his shoulder lightly before standing up and continuing down the aisle, while the other passengers discreetly watched the interaction. Meanwhile, back at the airport lounge in Dallas, Ashley Montgomery sat alone on an uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the clock on the wall as if time had stopped. She was nervous, aware that the incident with Malik would likely jeopardize her career. She tried to justify her actions to herself, but deep down she knew she had been in the wrong. Suddenly the door opened, and Charles entered, carrying a folder filled with documents. His expression was stern, but there was no anger in his eyes, only disappointment. He sat down across from Ashley and opened the folder, taking out a few papers. "Ashley, I need your full statement on what happened today. Mr. Reed was very clear about documenting every detail of the incident," Charles said, his tone firm. Ashley hesitated before starting. Well, Charles, I think it was all a big misunderstanding. I didn't mean to cause any problems." Charles raised his hand, cutting her off. "Listen, Ashley, you have every right to explain yourself. But understand this. What happened today will not be ignored. Mr. Reed is committed to ensuring that situations like this don't happen again. And honestly, I agree with him." Ashley lowered her gaze, feeling the weight of Charles's words. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then think carefully about what you'll say, because the consequences will be serious," Charles replied, before standing up and leaving the room, leaving Ashley alone with her thoughts. Back on the plane, the in-flight service had begun, and the flight attendants were handing out drinks and snacks to the passengers. Malik received a packet of cookies and a small juice box, thanking the flight attendant shyly. He was beginning to relax, feeling a little more comfortable in his surroundings. However, the moment of peace was interrupted by a woman seated in the row behind Malik. She was middle-aged, with a stern expression and an air of entitlement. Ever since the boy had boarded, she seemed visibly bothered by his presence, throwing judgmental glances every time he moved or made a sound. "Excuse me," the woman said, raising her hand to signal a flight attendant. A young flight attendant named Emily, who was responsible for that section of the plane, approached her politely. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman pointed toward Malik, not bothering to lower her voice or show any discretion. "That boy, he's sitting here alone. I find that a little inappropriate. Shouldn't there be someone supervising him? What if he causes trouble?" Emily blinked, clearly taken aback by the woman's blunt and prejudiced remarks. She glanced at Malik, who was now visibly uncomfortable, fiddling nervously with the packet of cookies in his hands. "Ma'am, he is seated in his assigned seat and has every right to be here. Furthermore, he hasn't done anything to warrant concern," Emily replied firmly, trying to keep her composure. The woman frowned, visibly dissatisfied. "It's not about rights. It's about common sense. I don't feel comfortable with him here. What if he turns out to be problematic?" Before Emily could respond, a deep, authoritative voice interrupted the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" Jonathan Reed asked as he approached, having noticed the elevated tone in the woman's voice. The woman looked at him, initially unsure of who he was. Jonathan, however, kept his composure and addressed her directly. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I'm the CEO of this airline, and I'd like to understand why you think this passenger shouldn't be here." The woman, visibly surprised and now somewhat nervous, tried to explain herself. "I didn't mean anything wrong. I just thought maybe it would be better if he were somewhere else with someone watching him." Jonathan crossed his arms, scrutinizing her. "He is exactly where he's supposed to be. And for your information, everyone on this plane is being supervised. My crew and I are here to ensure that all passengers, including you, have a safe and comfortable journey, but that requires mutual respect. This boy hasn't done anything but exist, and somehow that seems to be a problem for you." Nearby passengers, who had been quietly observing, began murmuring among themselves, some nodding in agreement with Jonathan. The woman, realizing she had lost the upper hand, flushed with embarrassment and sank into her seat, remaining silent. Jonathan turned to Emily. "Thank you for handling this. You did a great job." Then he gave Malik a reassuring look. "It's all right, kid. Remember what I said. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Malik nodded, trying to ignore the stares around him but feeling comforted by Jonathan's support. From that moment, he began to realize that not everyone in the world was like Ashley or the woman behind him. There were people like Jonathan, willing to stand up for what was right. The flight continued without further incidents, but the tension from earlier had left a mark on the passengers and crew. Malik, however, was learning an important lesson. Sometimes the kindness of a few people is enough to outweigh the cruelty of others, and this flight would be just the beginning of his transformation. As the plane finally began its descent into John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, the city emerged on the horizon like a shimmering sea of lights. Malik stared out the window, his wide eyes filled with wonder. He had never seen anything so massive, so alive. It felt as though the entire world was waiting for him. The anxiety that had clung to him since the beginning of the trip began to fade, replaced by a sense of curiosity and cautious hope. While the aircraft prepared for landing, Jonathan Reed, ever attentive to the details, stepped out of the cockpit once again. He wanted to ensure that Malik's arrival would go smoothly and, more importantly, that he could personally witness the boy's reunion with his new family. For Jonathan, this flight had become more than just a routine journey. It was an opportunity to make a meaningful difference. He approached Malik's seat once more, crouching down to speak with him. "Are you ready to meet your new family?" Jonathan asked, his tone warm and encouraging. Malik, who had remained quiet for most of the flight, managed a small smile, though his response betrayed the nervousness still bubbling inside him. "What if they don't like me?" he asked hesitantly. The question made Jonathan pause for a moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he could feel the weight of those words. He placed a reassuring hand on Malik's shoulder, his voice steady and sincere. "Malik, they already chose you. It's not about whether they'll like you. They chose you because they believe you belong in their family. And I believe that when you meet them, you'll realize you're not alone anymore. Trust me. Everything is going to be okay." Malik nodded, clutching his backpack tightly as if it were a shield against the unknown. The plane landed smoothly, and the final announcement came over the intercom. Passengers began standing up, retrieving their belongings, and exchanging polite smiles with the flight attendants. Jonathan remained near the airplane door, watching as Malik waited patiently for his turn to disembark. When it was finally Malik's turn, Jonathan made a point to accompany him off the plane. Malik seemed surprised but grateful to have someone by his side. Together, they walked down the jet bridge and into the terminal, where Malik's eyes darted around, taking in his surroundings. As they passed through the automatic doors leading to the main terminal, Jonathan spotted a couple standing nearby, holding a sign that read, "Welcome Malik," in colorful letters. They looked both anxious and overjoyed. The woman, an African-American with curly hair tied into a bun, wore a blue dress and had a radiant smile. The man next to her, slightly taller, had light skin, brown hair, and an approachable demeanor. They were Claire and Michael Davis, Malik's new parents. The moment Claire and Michael saw Jonathan and Malik approaching, Claire stepped forward, tears welling up in her eyes. Malik hesitated, stopping in his tracks, but Jonathan gave him a gentle nudge on the back. "Go ahead. That's your new family," Jonathan whispered. Malik took a deep breath before cautiously stepping forward. As he got closer, Claire knelt down to his level. Without saying a word, she opened her arms wide in an invitation that said more than words ever could. For a moment, Malik stood still, unsure, but then he finally stepped into her embrace. Claire hugged him tightly, as if silently promising that he would never be alone again. Michael soon joined them, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder with a warm, welcoming smile. "Welcome home, son," Michael said, his voice full of emotion. Malik, who had been holding back his tears for the entire journey, finally let them fall. But this time, they weren't tears of fear or sadness, they were tears of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt safe. Jonathan watched the reunion from a short distance, feeling a lump form in his throat. Over the years, he had witnessed countless moments of joy and connection in his line of work, but this one felt different. There was something profoundly human about seeing a child find a home, a place to belong. Claire stood up and approached Jonathan, still holding Malik's hand. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said, her voice warm and filled with gratitude. "The adoption agency told us you were with Malik during the flight. We can't thank you enough for everything you did." Jonathan shook his head humbly. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. He's an incredible kid and I just did what anyone should do. You're lucky to have him as your son." Claire looked at Malik, who now seemed more relaxed, and then back at Jonathan. "I don't know exactly what happened, but it sounds like it was a tough day for him. Still, I think he'll be okay now. Jonathan nodded, knowing she was right. He crouched down once more, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. Remember what I told you, champ. You deserve to be wherever you want to be, and no one can tell you otherwise. Malik gave him a more confident smile this time. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Jonathan stood back up, shook Michael's hand, and gave Claire a polite nod before saying goodbye to the trio. As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of peace. He knew that for Malik, this was just the beginning. But he also knew the boy was on the right path. As Jonathan exited the airport, the incident with Ashley was still fresh in his mind. He had received an update from Charles during the flight. Ashley would be temporarily suspended while the investigation continued, and more severe measures would be taken if her prejudiced behavior was confirmed. Jonathan had no doubts that firm action was necessary. Incidents like this were unacceptable, and he was committed to using it as an opportunity to reinforce training on inclusion and respect within the company. He knew that real change didn't come from speeches alone, but from concrete actions. Meanwhile, Malik, Claire, and Michael walked through the airport together, ready to start their new life as a family. Malik still clutched his backpack tightly, but it no longer felt heavy. As they stepped outside into the crisp New York air, Malik felt the wind against his face and smiled, this time with genuine joy. For the first time, he had a family. For the first time, he had a home. And deep down, Malik knew he would never forget the kindness of Jonathan Reed, the man who, for just a few hours, had been more than a CEO or a pilot. He had been an example of how a single act of compassion could change someone's life forever.